Well, tonight we're going to look at Ruth chapter 4, verses 4 through 8. And we are in the last section. It's called the last act, Act 4. It also corresponds to the fourth chapter. And it's all about redemption and fullness. Everything that went wrong in Act 1 somehow gets resolved in Act 4. So it takes us to the very end, and we can see through this whole process, even though the author doesn't mention it, that God's hand was in this at all times. Even when Naomi called herself bitter, even when she was bitter against God, God was still working in her life. And God was taking someone who had fullness, lost it all, and now has to regain it again. And sometimes in life we go through things like that where we'll have something, we'll lose it, and then we have to regain it. And that's always a struggle. And that was a struggle for Naomi. It's a struggle for anyone who has to go through that. But ultimately, Naomi's going to regain permanent honor and also dignity. And her story's going to end in a way that she could never really imagine. Because redemption and healing will take place for her family, but also for the nation of Israel. There's more to it as we get to the end of chapter 4 than just Naomi's story. God worked this out so that redemption could happen for a nation that was struggling. If you've ever read the book of Judges, in many ways it's the nation of Israel at its worst. Things really fell apart. I mean, Moses, the great leader, Joshua, the great leader, Joshua dies and everything falls apart. And it stays that way for several hundred years until King David takes the throne. And when David takes the throne, that's when things begin to get really good for the people of Israel. Well, like all the other acts, there's three scenes. In scene number 1, the main characters are Boaz, that closer relative redeemer, and also witnesses, and these witnesses were witnesses at a court setting. The location is the town gate, and that's where court sessions were held. And the main action is somebody's going to be the guardian redeemer. And it's either going to be this closer relative, which the story calls him Mr. So-and-so, basically. So it's either going to be Mr. So-and-so, he's never named, or it's going to be Boaz. And we'll figure that one out tonight, actually. The second scene involves Boaz, Ruth, Naomi, Obed, and the town's women. And Naomi and the women are going to have a dialogue, except for in the dialogue, the writer only records what the women say. Naomi doesn't actually say a word that's recorded. And then finally, we have Boaz's extended family, and that's the beginning of the royal line in the nation of Israel. And that's a very important development that takes place. So we'll eventually get there soon, in a couple of weeks. Scene 1, Boaz redeems at the town gate. And this particular scene is divided into 4 segments, and we talked about some of those last week. One was Boaz's preparation for court. So he leaves the threshing floor where he had met mysteriously Ruth the night before. Ruth leaves, Boaz leaves, and Boaz eventually ends up in the town gate. He's there for a court case. He's there to possibly redeem Ruth, but he has to meet up with this closer relative and determine what's going to take place. So he goes there very early in the morning. He also gathers together the elders, and the elders acted as the judges, kind of the judge and jury. So whatever's going to happen will be official business, and it needs to be recorded, and everybody needs to know what took place. So these 10 elders are the witnesses of what took place. Because back in the ancient world, a lot of people could not read and write. And so things were done a little differently because of that. And one of the things you needed for any legal transaction were witnesses. People could say, yes, this is what happened. I was there. I saw it. So he gathers the witnesses together. He also meets up with the kinsman redeemer, the one who's more closely related to Elimelech than himself. And he has the man set down, and he explains to the man what took place. about Naomi. She's now back. She has property. Property needs to be redeemed. She's not going to go out and work the field. Somebody needs to redeem it for her. Her husband has passed away. Her 2 sons have passed away. The inheritance line has stopped, and that needs to be resolved. So he lets this individual know what's taking place. There are 3 problems that need to be resolved. And the first one is Elimelech's land. He has property. And again, somebody has to redeem it. Someone has to go in and work the land. They would never really own it, but they could use it. And after making sure that Naomi was well taken care of, all of the profits from the land they could keep. And initially, because this man doesn't know the whole story, he's thinking, once Naomi passes away, if I redeem the land, I can keep the land because she doesn't have any descendants. Because initially, Boaz says nothing about Ruth. That comes up a little bit later. The second one is Elimelech's name. In the ancient world, you lived on through your descendants. So you would pass on kind of the family name and the family property to your son. And then your son would pass that on to his son, and so on and so on. But what happens if the line gets cut off? What if there's a man who doesn't have a son to give the property to? Well, that's a problem in the ancient world. And somebody has to come in and redeem that situation so that the property stays within the family. And that's going to be the big issue here in the book of Ruth. Then somebody has to care for Naomi. Now, Boaz has been doing it all along, but whoever redeems the property also agrees to take care of Naomi, and that's really not a big issue. That's a pretty easy thing to do. Well, we left off in verse 4 last week, and Boaz is talking to this closer relative, and he says to him, I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it. And it is the land that's owned by Elimelech, and he's really not going to buy it. What he's going to do is redeem it, and he's going to use it. It stays in the family, but he can use it and collect all the profits from it. And suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders, and if you will redeem it, then do so. So Boaz, who is probably also one of the elders, he has a very high position in that little town of Bethlehem. He's one of the major landowners, and he's following procedure as he should. He knows that this man is a closer relative, so he presents it to him, and he lets him know, hey, if you want to redeem it, you absolutely can. And so I'm offering this to you and giving you the opportunity to say yes to this. But if you will not redeem it, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it, meaning to redeem the property, except you, and I am next in line. So Boaz says it's all up to you. If you want to redeem the property, you can redeem the property. If you don't, I'm next in line. Kind of the implication is, if you don't, I'm going to. But, the first choice is up to you, and I'm giving you that first choice. But the property is going to be redeemed one way or the other. Either you're going to do it, or I'm going to do it. And in many ways, there's no reason not to do it. It could be highly profitable. And again, you don't actually own the land initially. You can use the land, plant your crops, sell your crops, make money. You have to take care of Naomi. That's pretty much your only expense. And if Naomi passes away, the property becomes yours. Unless she mysteriously ends up with another son between now and then. So from an economic profit and loss standpoint, it's a no-brainer. You should do it. In fact, the man says, of course, I'll redeem it. And again, I remember when I read that, I go, no, you can't do that. You're going to mess up the story. Because if you redeem it, that means Boaz is not going to marry Ruth. And based on chapter 3, that's what he wants to do. And I think Boaz knew that. And Boaz is doing this step by step because he knows the man's going to say yes to the property. I mean, who wouldn't? You know, as long as you have enough workers to actually work the land, it's a great deal. You should do that. So just simply from a money perspective, it's a yes. But that's not the end of the offer. Verse 5 is really the key verse in this whole conversation between Boaz and this man. Because then Boaz says, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. That verse is the key to the whole thing. So what Boaz says, okay, great, but I just want to let you know that when you redeem the land, there's a stipulation. There's Ruth, and you have to claim her as well, meaning you have to marry her. And you need to do that so that the dead man's name will stay with the property. And it's on that day that you buy it. So in other words, you can't say, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll redeem the property, give me 5 years and I'll see if the land is really worth it or not, and then we can come back and talk about Ruth later. No, can't do that. So on the very day that you get the land, you also get Ruth. So you get a wife thrown in as a bonus if you're going to redeem the land. Now, it's interesting that there are two ways to translate the main phrase in verse 5. And almost all scholars agree that it should be translated the way it is in the NIV, which in the NIV it says, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. But it can also be translated, I am going to acquire Ruth the Moabite. So the question becomes, is Boaz saying to this nearer relative, okay, if you want the land, that's great, but you also have to take Ruth? Or is he saying, okay, you want the land, that's great, and oh, by the way, I'm going to marry Ruth, which is going to impact what happens to the land you're about to redeem. So that becomes the question. And I think some translators wanted to go with Boaz making a declaration that he was going to marry Ruth because somehow Boaz has combined a couple of traditions. Marrying Ruth is somehow linked to the property. But where in the Bible does it ever say that a guardian redeemer, if he redeems the land, also has to marry the widow? It doesn't say that anywhere. In fact, if you're a guardian redeemer, there's nothing in the law about you getting married to anybody. Now, as a guardian redeemer, yes, if your family loses the property, it's your responsibility to redeem it. Because here's how it worked out in Israel. Land was very important. In fact, land has been important to the nation of Israel since about 2200 BC. That's when God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a land. And it's interesting that in 2200 BC, God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you a land. The promise was fulfilled about 900 years later. So about 1300 is when Joshua and the people of Israel conquered the land. So for the first time in their history, they have a land, thanks to Joshua and going into the promised land. And they divided the land. The last part of the book of Joshua, the part nobody reads because it's boring. This tribe gets this. This tribe gets this land. But that was important to them. Now to us, we're looking at it and going, I don't want to read that. But to them, it was strategically important because each tribe was given their land. And under Joshua, under the judges, the nation of Israel was 12 loosely connected tribes. You don't get a centralized government until King David. So just think about the United States as 50 independent states. You know, no central government. Well, some people actually may like that, but but that's what the nation of Israel was. They were 12 independent tribes, and each tribe had its land, and they fought for that land. Some of their relatives may have died fighting for their land. It's their property. And so if you're part of a tribe like the tribe of Judah, you want to hang on to your land. You don't want another tribe to take your land. So the tribes were then divided into clans, and these several clans made up the tribe. The clans were made up of family groups, and the family groups made up the clan. So you don't want the property to leave the tribe, you don't want it to leave the clan, and if possible, you don't want it to leave the family. So that was the big issue. Elimelech has died. His 2 sons have died. If nobody redeems the land, then the land will pass off of the family of Elimelech. They won't own it anymore. Somebody else is going to own it. That family will lose their property. They will also lose their family name. Because back in the ancient world, you passed on the property to your son, who passed it on to his son, and in essence, you were passing on the family name. So whose property is that? Oh, it's Elimelech's, it's Mahlon's, it's whoever's next in line. But if you lose that, that was a big deal, because property was a big deal to the people of Israel. So they did not want to lose the land. So here we have Boaz saying to the man, you're going to redeem the land. Okay, that's great, but as a kinsman redeemer, you would do that. As a kinsman redeemer, if somebody got into debt in your family and had to sell themselves into slavery, you could buy them out of slavery if you wanted to. If somebody did something wrong to somebody in your family or your clan, you may have to seek vengeance on that person and represent your family to do that. And a kinsman redeemer would do that. But nowhere does it state that a kinsman redeemer has to marry anybody. But Boaz has connected redeeming the property with redeeming the woman, redeeming the wife of the dead man who's Mahlon, whose wife remains, but he's passed away. So what has Boaz done? Perhaps he has broadened the definition of the kinsman redeemer. That the kinsman redeemer not only redeems the property, he does whatever the family needs. In this case, the family needs somebody to redeem the property and somebody to marry Ruth. So it could be that he's combined those traditions. Here, there are 2 institutions in Israel to preserve inheritance. And the first one was the kinsman redeemer. And it's talked about in Leviticus 25. That's to redeem the property. The other institution is something called levirate marriage. And that's talked about in Deuteronomy 25. But the interesting kicker to the whole thing is, according to this levirate marriage, if the firstborn son gets married and he dies, his brother is supposed to marry his widow and then inherit the land and the property and the family name in the name of his brother. But in this case, both brothers have died. There's no brother left to do that. Now, just think if you were the 3rd son of Elimelech and Naomi. You got Ruth and Orpah. You get both of them. So you'd marry them both. So, but there is no 3rd son. So it couldn't happen that way. So it looks like Boaz is trying to combine these 2 traditions. And he does it on purpose because of property ownership. And property ownership started in this story with Elimelech. It was passed on to Mahlon, and now there's nobody to pass it on to. But if Ruth gets married to a guardian redeemer, then they have a son together. The son gets the property in the name of Mahlon and Elimelech. So being a guardian redeemer is not just about the profits that you could get from the land. You're giving up something. You're going to marry this woman. You're going to have a child through this woman, and then the child gets the land. You don't get it. So if you have other sons or other children, they don't get that land. The land would only go to Ruth's son. So that's how that one would work. So in Israel, there's a close connection between the family name, the offspring, and the land. So the name was preserved through the inheritance of the property, passed down to the firstborn son. So that's how it worked. And one of the worst things that can happen to you is that your family line could be cut off. And that's about to happen to Elimelech and Mahlon. There's no one to pass the name down to. There's no one to pass the property down to. So, in essence, as history goes on, Elimelech's name is erased because somebody else is going to take the property and it's going to be in their name. So that's why they wanted to preserve that. And there's also a sense in which you kind of, if your name was mentioned, you were still kind of present even though you'd passed away. You kind of lived on in the lives of your children and grandchildren because the property started with you or you had it for a period of time. So the Redeemer of the land, here's the game plan. The Redeemer of the land would marry Ruth. They would have a son, and the son would inherit the land in the name of their grandfather, Elimelech. So in other words, it wouldn't be in the name of the guardian redeemer. It would be in the name of Elimelech. So in many ways, you were doing a family a favor by doing this, which is why the last part of verse 5 says, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Because through the son of Ruth, it would be passed from Elimelech to Mahlon to whoever that son is. And the name of Elimelech and Mahlon would live on through that property. So that's what we're dealing with. So both of those institutions, the guardian redeemer, it's to keep the family name and the property together. Same thing with levirate marriage. It was to keep the family name and the property together. And it's also interesting that it mentions the dead man's widow, or the wife of the dead man. And the only other place in the Old Testament where the wife of the dead man is referred to is Deuteronomy 25, which talks about levirate marriage. So she's the wife of the dead man, and the dead man needs to live on through a descendant. And levirate marriage would enable that to take place. So some really interesting traditions and customs back in the ancient world. So here's the bottom line. If the guardian redeemer acquires rights to the land, he must also acquire Ruth with the specific purpose of marrying her and fathering a child through her on behalf of Mahlon and Elimelech. So in essence, the child will be looked upon as if it's Mahlon's child, even though Mahlon is dead. And the inheritance will be passed on that way. Well, that's how most people look at the story, and that's probably the correct way to look at the story. And for us, we look at that and we go, that is so weird. And that is so strange. And we would never do things that way. Well, again, the property. It's got to stay in the tribe. It's got to stay in the clan. And if possible, It has to stay in the family. You can't lose the property. And that was their thinking. So when we think of marriage today, we think of falling in love with someone and we marry them for that reason. Not to do them a favor so they can have a child who can inherit some property from somebody else. We don't think of that. We'd look at that and go, that is strange, and no, I'm not doing that. But back in the ancient world, yes, you would do that. It would be part of your responsibility to do that. Now, there are those who want to translate this differently, where Boaz would actually say to this closer relative, yes, you can redeem the property, but oh, by the way, I will marry Ruth. And the idea is very similar. If he marries Ruth and the two of them have a son, the son gets the property. So the guardian redeemer may be thinking, wait a second, why do I want to redeem the land? Because as soon as a child comes along, I'm going to lose it anyways. So why should I even bother to do that if I'm not going to actually be able to keep the property? The property's not going to belong to me. The property will belong to Ruth's son. So it's a neat way of not having to have the levirate marriage, because this is extending the levirate marriage. It's usually just the brother who was under obligation. It's usually not a guardian redeemer who has to marry the widow. So if Boaz says, I'm going to just up and marry Ruth, that would solve that problem. But at the same time, if that was true, back on the threshing floor, why didn't Boaz just say to Ruth, I need to go to court today, and after I resolve a few things, yes, I'll marry you. He didn't say that. He made no guarantees to her because of what the guardian redeemer might do. So sometimes scholars try to make things simpler, but usually when you make them simpler, that means it really didn't happen that way. It's just our attempt to make the story a little easier. It would eliminate the idea of combining the kinsman redeemer and the levirate marriage. So that would go away. There would be no levirate marriage. It would simply be Boaz saying he would marry Ruth. But again, most scholars translate it, you must acquire her. And the reason you must do that is so that the family name lives on. And that becomes the big kicker, especially in verse 6. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it. Interesting, he says, I don't want to redeem it, or I won't redeem it, I refuse to redeem it. No, he says, I can't redeem it. And I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I can't do it. So somehow this closer relative thinks, if I marry Ruth, and I have a son by Ruth, and this son gets the land, somehow that's going to mess up my estate. It's going to mess up my plans for my inheritance. And some scholars think he's exaggerating, but there seems to be an element of anxiety that he has about marrying Ruth. And it doesn't say why he doesn't want to marry Ruth, but scholars have come up with 3 suggestions. The first one is he just didn't like Ruth. I mean, maybe there was no physical attraction. Maybe he knew about her, but, just didn't care. So he didn't really want to marry somebody he had no interest in. And that's probably not true. Now, that would be true today. That would be a good excuse today not to marry somebody. You're just not attracted to the person. But back in the ancient world, probably not. A second reason is the man already has a wife and children, and he doesn't want to complicate things. And that's a good possibility. Back in the ancient world, you could have more than one wife. David, who has not yet been born, ended up with several wives. Also ended up with a lot of trouble. But anyways, that's another story. But it was possible to have more than one wife back then. But maybe he thinks, I don't want to complicate this. I've got my property. I've got my wife, I've got my sons, I know what I'm going to do with my land. If I get married to somebody and bring in another son who's going to have land, that could complicate things. In fact, he may be thinking, if I have a son by Ruth who's then related to Mahlon and Elimelech, they may hold a higher place in the clan than I do. And that son that's born could take the land from me and my sons, and my name could be eliminated. So I'm not doing that. So that could have been a legitimate fear on his part. Also, Ruth is a Moabite. In fact, if we go back a couple of verses, Boaz says, you have to acquire Ruth the Moabite. And it all depended, especially during this time period, what the family thought about the Moabites. A lot of Israelites wanted nothing to do with the Moabites. And they wanted to keep their race pure, which meant you could not have an Israelite getting married to a Moabite. Some of them obviously didn't care. That wasn't a big deal for them. But for some, it may have. And this other relative, this closer redeemer, may have had a family member who didn't like Moabites. And he goes, there is no way I'm marrying a Moabite because I got to live with that guy. And, I see that guy every day, and I'm not going to put up with what he's going to say every day for the rest of my life if I marry her, so I'm not doing it. That's a possibility. The only reason he gives is that it would endanger his estate. And it could be bringing in another son who will inherit land could endanger his inheritance to his sons that he now has by the wife that he has at this particular time. So that is a good possibility. But the author doesn't explain it. He doesn't go into any detail. It's enough for him that the man says, I don't want to do it. Because if he doesn't want to do it, Boaz has already promised that he will redeem not only the land, he'll redeem Ruth as well. And for the author, that seems to be enough. And so he just kind of leaves it at that. Well, verse 7 is really interesting. And in the NIV, it's got parentheses around it. Because what we have in verse 7 is something that we could call a parenthetical comment. We could call it an aside. What's happening in verse 7 is the author's telling the story, and basically Boaz is doing all the talking up to this point, but something's going to happen in the story. It's a custom, and the custom has gone away. It was no longer being practiced when this particular writer wrote the book of Ruth. So he feels a need to explain the custom to the reader before he even reads about the custom. Now, if he were writing today, it would be the opposite. He would tell us what happened, and then he would explain the custom. But this ancient writer is going to explain the custom before we even read about it. So it's a little bit different. So this parenthetical comment. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to be final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Yeah. In ancient times, in America, we did an old-fashioned handshake. Today, we hire lawyers who charge lots of money to draft up this document, part of which you can't read because it's in legal terms. And for some reason, lawyers like to take simple concepts and make them sound complex and difficult to read. And so it's all in lawyer speak. And at the bottom, you're supposed to sign it. And sometimes you sign it and somebody witnesses it. Sometimes your signature has to be notarized. But that's how we do things today. Everything is done by paper and signing things. If you go to buy a car today, they give you a stack of paper like this. A house is probably like this anymore. It's been a long time since I bought a house, but lots of papers that you have to sign. Well, back in the ancient times, if you made a legal deal, especially if somebody was going to turn something down and give you the opportunity to do that, they would do something rather fascinating. They would take off a sandal and give you their sandal. And that sandal would be your physical representation of the fact that a deal had been made. Fascinating. And it was an ancient custom, so much so, eventually they decided not to do this anymore, because it's kind of weird. Hey, I'm walking around with this guy's sandal, and I've got a whole closet full because I made all these deals, He's like, what am I going to do with all these? I hope the sandal fits my foot as well. So, Mr. So-and-so is not going to redeem the land. He's going to pass it off to Boaz. And so the transaction is then confirmed in the presence of the witnesses by this man taking off his sandal and handing it to Boaz, meaning he's refusing the deal. In many ways, the sandal represented the foot, and the foot represented authority and ownership. So in many ways, he was saying, okay, here's the deal. Here's my sandal. Meaning, I'm not going to set foot on that property. That property's not mine. It's not mine to own. Here's the sandal to prove that I want nothing to do with that property. It's all now in your hands to do what you want to do. So that was the interesting ancient ceremony and how that took place. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. And he removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz. Strange way of doing business. But one thing's now true. This nearer relative, this closer guardian redeemer, is now out of the picture. He comes into the scene in chapter 4. He's never named. He has this opportunity to redeem the land, and he says, yeah, I'll do that. But when Ruth was thrown in, no, I can't do that. And so he walks away from the deal. And now Boaz can complete the deal, just as he wanted to do in the first place. In a book like this, you often have certain symbols that are used. And it's interesting that when Ruth goes to the threshing floor, one of the things she does, she uncovers Boaz's feet. Basically so his feet can get cold and he can wake up and she can tell her story. But here this guardian redeemer removes his sandal, which of course would expose his foot. So it's the uncovering of his own foot. Ruth uncovers Boaz's feet so she can approach him. But this guardian redeemer exposes his foot so that he can walk away from a deal. He's not interested in the deal. Fascinating story of how God worked everything out. Now the scene has been set for Boaz to go before the witnesses, make his case that he's going to be the guardian redeemer, and that part of that will include a wedding ceremony, and he will get married to Ruth. And God worked that whole process out. And it's amazing that Ruth stayed with the process to the very end. And so did Boaz. He just let God lead him every step of the way. It took a while. There was a scare along the way when the closer guardian redeemer said, oh yeah, I'll take the land. But God even worked that out. So the lesson is that God can work things out. We need to trust Him. God has a plan. God may have given you a plan, a dream, a hope. God can work that out. But you have to trust Him. There may be some setbacks. There may be some delays, but God can work out the plan. And next week, we're going to look at Boaz's response to this, and also the response of the elders in the community to this as well. Well, let me close this tonight in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are a God who knows how to do things, get things done. You give us dreams, you give us hopes, and we have this desire in our heart. And then we have to trust you to work it out, to go through the process, to go through the ups and downs, the delays, and then see you finally bring the plan together. And to know that all along you were there, working behind the scenes, doing everything that you needed to do to turn the plan, the dream, into a reality. So, Father, I thank you that you did that back then, and you continue to do that today. And Father, I pray that whatever's on our heart, whatever dream, whatever goal, whatever desire you've given us, that we will see you work that out. And we will trust you until it does come to a reality. Thank you, God, for being our loving Heavenly Father. I pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.